"Sorry, sir, this table's for guests on the list only." The young waiter's words hung in the air like frost. Jack Milton, standing in the doorway with a worn box in his hands, nodded once, stepped aside, and disappeared into the periphery. The wind off the bay still carried a hint of winter that afternoon, threading through the narrow streets of St. Albans, Maine, and rattling the halyards of the docked sailboats. Inside the old dining hall of the yacht club, though, it was warm, too warm. Brass light fixtures cast a soft glow over polished wood paneling, the air thick with the smell of fried cod and drawn butter. At long tables covered in crisp white linen, the town's veterans, local officials, and a few uniformed officers were already mid-conversation, voices blending with the faint clink of cutlery and the occasional toast. It was the annual memorial luncheon for fallen sailors, and every seat had been carefully arranged. The head table, long and stately, was flanked by the mayor, the naval base commander, and a handful of retired captains. Beside them, in smaller clusters, sat the families of men whose names were etched on the bronze plaque mounted above the fireplace. The double doors at the far end opened with a soft groan of old hinges. A thin, weathered man stepped inside. His silver hair was combed back, though the wind had tried its best to undo it. The navy blue jacket he wore was faded at the seams, shoulders sagging slightly, the fabric polished to a dull shine by years of wear. It was the kind of garment that had once been sharp, precise, part of a life that demanded it, but was now merely familiar, almost invisible. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box wrapped in a folded nautical chart. The chart was yellowed and softened with age, its edges curled. The box was not heavy, but he held it as one might hold something breakable, his fingers resting lightly on its corners. Jack Milton had walked 3 miles from the bus stop to get here, not because he couldn't afford a cab, though, truth be told, he probably couldn't, but because it felt wrong to arrive in anything but the slow, deliberate way sailors had always arrived somewhere important, on foot, with the sea close enough to smell. Before he could take more than a few steps inside, a young waiter intercepted him. The boy couldn't have been older than 20, with a white shirt too stiff for comfort and a tie knotted just a shade too tightly. His smile was polite, but practiced. "Sorry, sir, this table's for guests on the list only. Family and command only." There was no malice in the voice, only procedure, but the phrase "family and command" seemed to lodge in the air between them. Jack's gaze dropped briefly to the polished floor. "Of course," he said, quietly enough that it barely carried. The waiter's attention had already shifted to someone behind him. Jack stepped aside, crossing the room towards a long wooden bench beneath a bank of tall windows. From here he could see the harbor, gray water, gulls wheeling low, the masts of sailboats swaying slightly with the tide. The smell of fried cod and baking rolls drifted over from the buffet tables. Jack's stomach tightened, not with hunger exactly, but with the sudden awareness of how long it had been since breakfast. Still, he made no move towards the food. He set the box carefully on the bench beside him and folded his hands over his knees, letting the low murmur of conversation wash past him. Around him, laughter rose and fell in bursts. Glasses clinked. A group near the center broke into a round of applause for a story just told, though Jack couldn't hear the punchline. No one looked his way. He could have been a piece of the furniture, or a stranger waiting for someone who might never come. Only one person seemed to notice him at all, a boy, maybe 10 years old, moving through the room with a breadbasket. He was helping refill the tables, his face flushed from the warmth of the kitchen. When he reached Jack's bench, he slowed, his eyes catching on the patch sewn into the left sleeve of that old jacket, a ghostly, weathered emblem. It was an anchor overlaid with the silhouette of a diving bell and a set of wings, stitched in muted gray and white thread. The patch was frayed, its edges rough where stitches had long since loosened. Most wouldn't recognize it, but the boy stared a moment longer. Jack let his hand drop and gave the boy a small nod. The boy, perhaps sensing something unspoken, moved on without a word. The sounds of the room swelled again. Toasts, a chair scraping back, the warm cadence of a well-practiced speech. Jack stayed where he was, waiting not for food, not for acknowledgement, but for the right moment to do what he had come here to do. The light outside had shifted by the time the salad course came and went. Golden afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, bright enough to throw slow-moving patches of light across the polished floorboards. The bay was alive now, sails catching wind, gulls calling sharply as they dove for scraps near the docks. Inside, though, the air remained heavy with ceremony. A man at the head table began reading a roll call of the fallen, his voice low and deliberate, pausing after each name as the audience murmured, "Present." The sound was solemn, but not intimate, more ritual than memory. Jack sat with his hands folded over his knees, his back straight despite the worn ache in his shoulders. His eyes, however, drifted often to the small box beside him. The nautical chart wrapped around it was smoothed perfectly flat against the wood, the faded lines of bearings and depths barely visible in the dim light. Anyone else might have thought it a quaint wrapping, something decorative, but for Jack, every crease, every scuff was part of a map he'd once known by heart, waters he'd sailed, currents he could still feel under his feet when he closed his eyes. A clatter of forks and muffled laughter jolted him from his thoughts. At the table nearest his bench, a pair of middle-aged men in crisp blazers were swapping stories, the kind told more for entertainment than accuracy. One leaned back in his chair, gesturing broadly, and that's when we knew the rescue was a bust. Nobody could have made it through that storm. The other man laughed and shook his head. Except maybe one of those old sea ghosts, eh? They were half myth anyway. The first man snorted. Myth is right. Heard they got shut down after some botched op. Too much risk for too little reward. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the harbor. His thumb found the edge of the box and pressed there until the nail hurt. The sea ghosts had never been myths, and the risk had never been too little, but correcting them now would do nothing. The boy with the bread basket returned, this time setting a small plate of rolls on the edge of Jack's bench without a word. The gesture was quiet, almost conspiratorial, and before Jack could thank him, the boy had darted away. Jack let the rolls sit untouched. He wasn't hungry, not for food anyway. From across the hall came the rich baritone of the naval base commander, recounting a harrowing story of a failed engine during a training exercise. It was well told, and the room leaned in at the right moments, laughing when cued, sighing in sympathy where expected. Jack's gaze drifted back to the box. He'd seen engines fail in worse conditions. He'd seen decks on fire, the sea turning black with oil. He'd seen men vanish beneath the waves without a sound. And he'd seen Captain Lewis, seen the exact moment when the sea decided it would not return him. A faint metallic taste filled Jack's mouth, and he realized he'd been clenching his jaw. He forced it to relax, flexing his fingers until they stopped trembling. The luncheon wore on. Waiters refilled glasses, plates were cleared. Conversations blurred together. To the others in the room, Jack was invisible now, another face in the periphery, someone who had wandered in from the cold out of curiosity or habit. But the truth was, Jack had been to this luncheon before. Not in recent years. He'd stopped coming when the faces he knew stopped appearing. But this year was different. This year, a letter had arrived. It was written in a careful, almost hesitant hand. Mr. Milton, my name is Sarah Lewis. I believe you served with my father, Captain Thomas Lewis, during your time with the Sea Ghosts. I never knew him well. He died when I was very young, but I have something of his that belongs with his shipmates. If you are willing, I would like you to present it at the memorial luncheon this May. The yacht club will be hosting. I will be there." Enclosed had been a photograph of his father, taken before Jack had known him, standing on the deck of a ship, smiling into the wind. And with it, a medal. Not one that could be replaced, not one easily displayed in a shadow box. This medal had been earned in salt water and fire, and it had left the ocean with a price. Jack had wrapped it in the only thing he felt appropriate, the chart of the waters where they had last sailed together. And he had brought it here, to deliver it into her hands because that was what had been asked of him. From his bench, he scanned the crowd. She was here somewhere. He'd spotted her earlier, a woman in her 50s sitting alone near the back, quiet in a way that felt familiar. But the timing wasn't right yet. This wasn't a thing to be done between speeches or over the clatter of dessert plates. Another toast went up at the head table, this one louder. A retired Commodore stood, glass raised high, recounting a moment from decades past when his crew had narrowly escaped disaster. Jack caught only fragments, squall lines, radio silence, miracle navigation, but each phrase pulled at something inside him. His eyes wandered again to the patch on his sleeve. The boy returned once more, now without his breadbasket. He hesitated, then sat briefly on the bench beside Jack. "What's the ghost for?" he asked quietly, glancing at the faded emblem. Jack studied him for a long moment. "It's for the ones who come home," he said, "and the ones who don't." The boy nodded, as if that made perfect sense, then slipped away before Jack could say more. By now, the speeches were winding down, and the energy in the room shifted towards something looser, less formal. Officers leaned back in their chairs. Someone began telling a joke at the far table. The smell of coffee drifted in from the kitchen. Jack kept his place, his patience as steady as the tide. The box remained beside him, waiting. What he didn't see, what he couldn't yet see, was the moment at the head table when Vice Admiral Robert Hargraves, seated between the mayor and the base commander, happened to glance toward the far windows. His gaze swept idly past the harbor, the gathered guests, the flutter of linen in a draft, then stopped, locked onto the thin figure in the corner. The Admiral's expression changed in an instant, like a chart shifting from calm waters to marked shoals. He set down his coffee cup without a word, his eyes narrowing. And for the first time all afternoon, someone was looking directly at Jack Milton. Vice Admiral Robert Hargraves had learned, over decades of service, to trust the instincts that came in sudden, jarring flashes. The man by the windows was older, thinner, but the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested, not clenched, not idle, was a posture Hargraves had seen before. He rose without thinking. Conversations faltered at his abrupt movement. The mayor turned to him with a question in his eyes, but Hargraves didn't answer. He stepped away from the head table, his polished shoes making a deliberate rhythm against the wood floor. Across the room, waiters shifted awkwardly to give him space. A few guests turned in their seats to watch. Jack noticed the stir only when the Admiral was halfway to him. His first instinct was to stand, but something in Hargraves' expression stopped him. A mix of disbelief, relief, and something older, deeper. The Admiral halted in front of him, his spine straight, his chin lifted. Then, with the precision of a man who had never once performed a salute halfway, he came to attention and snapped his right hand to his brow. The sound in the room collapsed into silence. Knives and forks stilled midair. Even the gulls outside seemed to have taken pause. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hargraves said, turning to face the crowd, his voice carrying like a signal over open water. "This man once pulled me and 7 others from a burning engine deck when our ship was going down. If not for him, half of us wouldn't be here today." Gasps, low murmurs, the shifting of chairs. Jack sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, as though the words belonged to someone else. "I was an ensign then," Hargraves continued, "young and sure I knew everything. That day, when the fire took hold and the water began to rise, I was certain it was over. But Jack Milton," he turned, letting the name land like a wave hitting the hull, "wouldn't leave anyone behind. He went back into that hell again and again until every one of us was clear. He carried men twice his size. He breathed smoke for hours. And when the medics tried to take him, he refused treatment until the last crewman was out." The stillness deepened, thick and almost fragile. At the far tables, men and women who moments earlier had been laughing or trading old stories now stood slowly, as if some unspoken order had passed through the room. One by one they came to attention. Hands rose to brows. Uniforms and civilian jackets alike, every person who could stand, stood and saluted. Jack shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it. He had lived decades without expecting anyone to remember, let alone honor that day. It felt like being pulled from deep water into bright, relentless sunlight. Hargraves lowered his salute, stepping closer. "Sir, if you'll allow it, the head table is yours." Jack's voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. "I'm not here for honors, Admiral. I came to return this." He reached for the box, setting it gently on the nearest table. With careful hands, he unfolded the nautical chart, revealing the wood beneath. The grain was worn smooth, the brass hinges dulled by salt air. Jack opened it. Inside lay a medal, its ribbon faded, the metal still catching light as if it had waited for this day. And beneath it, a letter. The handwriting was neat, precise, a style that belonged to another era. "This belonged to Captain Lewis. He died in the same operation you just mentioned. His daughter asked me to deliver it to his family myself." A ripple went through the crowd. Heads turned, searching. In the far corner, the woman Jack had noticed earlier rose slowly from her seat. Her hands were clasped in front of her, as if holding herself steady. Jack picked up the medal and letter, crossed the room with a sailor's steady gait, and stopped before her. "Sarah Lewis?" She nodded, her throat working to form words she couldn't quite find. Jack held out the medal. "This is yours," he said. "Your father earned it, and you deserve to have it in your hands." Her fingers closed around the medal as though it might vanish. She looked at the letter, then back at him, eyes brimming. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the second word. Jack nodded once, then stepped back, letting the moment belong to her. When he returned to his bench, Hargraves was still standing, watching him with something that looked almost like gratitude, but carried the gravity of a debt unpaid. Around them, the noise of the room began to return, but softer now, tempered by what had just unfolded. People moved differently, approaching Jack with measured steps, offering handshakes, brief words of respect. Some simply touched the back of the bench in passing, a quiet acknowledgement. The luncheon was no longer just a memorial. It had become a gathering bound, for this moment at least, by the knowledge of what one man had once done when the sea tried to take everything. The head table remained untouched, the empty seat Hargraves had offered Jack standing as a silent invitation, but Jack stayed by the windows, hands folded loosely before him, letting the room adjust to the shift in gravity his presence had caused. Hargraves approached again, this time without formality. "At least let us—" Jack shook his head before the sentence could finish. "I came for one thing, Admiral, and I've done it." He gestured toward Sarah Lewis, now seated with the medal in her lap, the letter unfolded on the table before her. She read slowly, her fingertips resting on the paper, as though anchoring herself. "It was never mine to keep," Jack added quietly. The Admiral studied him for a moment, then inclined his head in silent understanding. Word of what had just happened spread through the hall in murmured retellings. Those who were too far to see asked those who had. Faces softened, postures straightened. The easy chatter of earlier was replaced with a steadier hum, respectful, almost reverent. Then something unexpected happened. From the far end of the room, a man in a faded Coast Guard jacket rose and saluted. Another followed. Soon the gesture moved like a slow wave across the dining hall, until every person, uniformed or not, was standing again, saluting not just Jack, but the unseen Captain Lewis, and perhaps all the names on the bronze plaque above the fireplace. Sarah rose too, still holding the medal, and gave Jack a small nod. Gratitude without embellishment. He returned it, the exchange needing no words. When the salutes lowered, Hargraves addressed the room. Not all heroes come for recognition. Some come because duty doesn't end when the mission does. Today we remember them all, but let's not forget the living who carry those stories. Applause followed, not raucous but steady, measured, with the rhythm of something meant to last. Jack endured it with the quiet discomfort of someone who'd never sought an audience. When it subsided, he picked up the empty chart, folded it with care, and slid it back under his arm. The mission, as he'd defined it, was complete. But as he turned toward the door, several hands reached out to him. Firm shakes, claps on the shoulder, brief thank yous from strangers who now knew his name. And for the first time that afternoon, Jack allowed a small, fleeting smile. By the time the luncheon wound down, the golden light from the windows had shifted to the cooler tones of late afternoon. The speeches were finished, the coffee cups empty. A few guests lingered in clusters, trading quieter stories now, voices softened by the day's emotion. The bronze plaque over the fireplace seemed to glow faintly in the dimming light, as though even the metal had absorbed something from the hours just past. Jack had stayed in his place until the hall began to empty. He preferred it that way. No grand departures, no crowd at the door. He waited until Sarah Lewis had tucked the medal back into its case and folded her father's letter carefully into her handbag. She glanced toward him once more as she left, a look that held enough unspoken meaning to last a lifetime. When the moment felt right, Jack picked up the folded nautical chart, tucking it under his arm. He moved through the now loosened aisles without hurry, pausing once to thank the boy who had brought him the rolls. The boy only shrugged, but there was a new respect in the way his eyes followed him to the door. Outside, the late-day breeze carried the smell of salt and the sound of halyards striking masts in slow, metallic rhythm. The pier stretched ahead, weathered boards leading out into the bay. Jack walked its length until the water lapped quietly beneath him. He sat on a bench facing the harbor, the chart still tucked at his side. From his pocket, he drew a small coin, brass worn smooth on one side, the other stamped with the crest of a ship long since decommissioned. It had been given to him the day he first boarded her, a token from a man he'd never see again. Turning it once between his fingers, he placed it gently on the railing in front of him. The coin caught the last shard of sunlight before lying still. A gull wheeled overhead, crying out before diving toward the distant docks. Jack watched it disappear, then leaned back against the bench, letting the wind work its way into the folds of his jacket. In the weeks that followed, word of that afternoon wove itself quietly through St. Albans. Those who had been in the dining hall spoke of it in the same tone they used for rare storms or seasons of good fishing, moments that could not be manufactured, only witnessed. At the yacht club, someone proposed an addition to the memorial plaque. Not another list of names, but a small inscription on a brass plate mounted beside the door. For those who return, and for those who keep their stories safe until the time is right. It was voted on without dissent. Months later, the dining hall would host a different kind of gathering. Not a memorial, not a formal ceremony, just a weekly supper for local veterans. It was held under a new name, the Jack Milton Maritime Veterans Center. The title was painted in modest navy letters above the entrance, and Jack had nothing to do with the decision. On the night of the first supper, the room was full but not loud. Men and women in uniforms of every era, young sailors on shore leave, fishermen who had served decades earlier. They came, they ate, and they stayed. Some spoke openly. Others simply sat with a plate in front of them, knowing they didn't have to explain their presence. Jack was there, in his usual jacket, at a table near the back. He didn't give a speech. He didn't let them introduce him. He simply watched the room with the quiet satisfaction of a man who recognized the shape of something good taking root. From that night on, whenever Jack walked into a dining hall in town, be it the Yacht Club, a VFW hall, or even the small cafe on Main Street, people noticed. And more often than not, they stood. Some saluted, some just nodded. Jack never lingered in those moments. He accepted them as a sailor accepts the sea, grateful for its calm, prepared for its storms, never mistaking either for permanence. But sometimes, late in the evening, when the streets were empty and the only sound was the slow lap of water against the pier, Jack would walk to that same bench overlooking the harbor. The coin would still be there, tarnished now, and he would rest his hand on it for a moment before heading home. It wasn't a memorial. It wasn't a monument. It was just a marker. Small, unassuming, like the man who had placed it there, reminding anyone who happened upon it that some deaths are repaid not in ceremony, but in the quiet certainty that they were never forgotten. And for Jack Milton, that was enough.